Hello and welcome to the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For the free tutorial today, I'd like to share with you the Woven Swing Bangle. Now, I deliberated about what to call this. I wanted to call it a belly dancer style bangle, but I wasn't sure if that would make any sense. So let's head down to the board, we'll take a closer look at the project, and I'll take you through each of the techniques involved in creating this piece today. So here is the Woven Swing Bangle. I've created a 3/4 bangle which goes most of the way around the wrist and then added a hook and loop closure on the underside. You can obviously play around with the dimensions. You can make half bangles or just bar sections connected with chain, whatever you fancy. What I'm going to share with you today is how to create this woven looped section, so that you can create the centerpiece to this design and then play around with it as you please. I'll show you also how you can use beads to create these lovely little dangling parts, or if you prefer, we can make little spirals without beads as well, and then it's a little bit more like that belly dancer style to which I referred earlier. In today's video, I'm going to be using my bail making pliers with the 2 and 4mm pins. We're going to be using the 2mm size, and this is going to give us really lovely, even, repeatable loops on those looped segments. Now, depending on how large you want the woven section to be, I'm going to be making an example with, I think, 7 loops on it today, but you can make smaller than that, or you can make the 3/4 bangle, which has 13 loops. My best advice to you would be to work directly from the reel. Now, the wire I'm using today is 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and we're going to start just by unspooling a good sort of 1.5 foot, about 18 inches or so of wire. We're unlikely to need it all, but it does just make it easier if it's unspooled. So I'm just going to trim the end away flush, and then I'm going to leave around about 1 inch on the end before I start turning those loops. So all I'm going to do is rotate those pliers around until I get a little loop in that strand of wire. So what we're looking to do is to repeat that process the number of times and the distance apart that you desire. Mine are quite close together because I really wanted to give this clustered belly dancer style look to this particular piece of jewellery, but you can of course play around with the distance apart that you create them. So if I just continue to rotate that wire around using those bail makers, you'll see that it doesn't take very long at all to make those loops come to life. So I've set the gap basically between those first 2 loops. So what we're going to do is add a 3rd one on before deciding whether or not those are at the right kind of distance and frequency on that baseline. So I've made a mistake on purpose because I want you to see how easy it is to undo. So loop number 2 and loop number 3 are a bit closer together than loop number 1 and loop number 2. So if that happens to you, you can pop the pin back into that loop and just roll along like so, and then pull that baseline back away from you, so that you can increase the distance. Now, what you might find is that there's a little bit of a kink on that baseline. Really easy to fix with any sort of flat facing pliers until you get that a similar distance between each loop. Now you're going to need to make that twice, so 2 looped sections. Again, I would suggest working from the reel, and do allow a good sort of 1 to 1.25 inches on the end. Once you've created the number of loops that you want, what we're going to do is to create a loop at 90 degrees on the end. So if I just rotate that looping plier or bail making plier around, remove that away, you'll see that at 90 degrees we've got a little looped section here. So continue until you have enough loops at the correct frequency, and do make sure that they line up, so that when you've created 2 of these sections, finishing off with another loop at 90 degrees to those main loops. So here it's going downwards towards the board. Once I finish looping, I will finish off with a loop that also goes downwards towards the board, and then you can cut the wire away. So let's have a look at some pieces I prepared a moment ago. As I mentioned, you can of course make different sizes, different frequencies of the loops on that section of wire. Play around with the design to your heart's content. So what I've done is I've created 7 loops on that piece of wire, with a single loop at either end at 90 degrees. And I will do that twice, and then I will just hold them up side by side and make sure that those loops are reasonably opposite one another. Now, if you think, oh my goodness, the downward facing loops are at opposite sides, all you need to do is flip it over and suddenly they're facing the right way. So don't panic too much about that. Just create two that are identical to begin with, and then you can flip them over so that they sit opposite when you need them to. So for the next section, we'll be cutting 3 lengths of wire that fit between these 2 looped sections. So again, the length of wire that you'll be using will be defined by how big a piece you want to create for your little section of dingly dangly woven bangle. In order to keep the same distance between each loop on your baseline, you might like to employ a pair of pliers just to give you an idea of how you can make that a repeatable size. Or of course you can just eyeball it and then put the 2 pieces back to back to see whether or not they line up. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. You've got loops on the end at 90 degrees. They're both identical. What they need to be is opposite to one another. So all you need to do is just turn it around. They will make it happen as soon as you sort of move them into the correct orientation. The next thing we're going to need to do is to cut 3 more lengths of wire. Again, I'm demonstrating with 1mm or 18 gauge. This is a medium copper coated anti-tarnish wire, but you could work with raw copper, or you could take that size up a level and use 1.25mm or 16 gauge. It will make a really substantial, beautiful piece of jewellery. It's nice to kind of get to grips with the technique using that slightly lighter 1mm 18 gauge. So we now need to get 3 pieces of wire with loops on either end. That the loops will then sit at the same length as your looped sections. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to work from the reel ideally, but that's very difficult to show you on the screen. So we'll pop a loop on one end, again employing that 2mm side of my lovely Beadalon bail making pliers. Once I've got one of those loops into position, I'm going to give that a bit of a squish just to hold that position. You'll need to add some strength to each of these loops before we move on anyway. And then grab one of those looped sections, lie the 2 pieces side by side, get the 2 loops to line up, and then what we'll need to do is to pop our looping pliers through one of those so that you know exactly where to create the bend that will form your loop. And then once you've created one of those, you can use that as kind of a baseline to measure the other 2. So in all, you'll end up with 5 pieces of wire. 2 of them will be looped and they will be opposite to each other in terms of how they sit. So let's just open those up. I'm going to put them with the loops upwards because it's easier for them to sit on the board. So you've got 2 of those, one with the loops to the right, one with the loops to the left, and then you'll need 3 of these in the middle. But before we move on to the next stage, what we'll need to do is make sure that each of the loops at the end of each 5 pieces of wire are nice and strong. So appreciating that you may not want to mark your wire, you could employ a nylon jaw plier to help you. But I'm just going to add a little bit of strength just over the end of those pieces, over to the other end, and just make sure that they are nice and strong. It's really important to do this because it forms a functional, physical aspect to the bar that we're creating for this woven swing bangle. So I'm going to take a moment just to make sure that all of my baselines, the line of wire that sits at the top of those loops, I'm going to make sure that it's nice and flat all the way along. I'm going to make sure that the loops on either end are really, really strong as well. And of course that they all line up. So just going to take a moment to do that and I'll join you back in a second. For the next part of the tutorial, we're going to be weaving all of these 5 sections of wire together, hence the woven swing bangle. So I've taken a second to try and get these as close to straight as possible. They will kind of be drawn together in a way. So talking about wire gauges, it's a little bit easier to work with the heavier 1.25 or 16 gauge. at this stage because it's nice and easy to get them straight and they don't get twisted whilst you're weaving. However, it's just a little bit easier to generate the loops with the 1mm or 18 gauge. So it's horses for courses, and once you've learnt the technique, it's much easier to kind of go for those heavier gauges. So we have 5 wires. The loops on the strands of wire which will sit either side of the bangle. So I've got the top number 5 wire with the loops going upwards, and the loops on the end are going down towards the board. That's really important because the weave I'm going to share with you is different on the underside to the upper side. So if you imagine that the wire at the bottom is called wire number 1, that's got loops coming downwards towards me, and the end loops are moving downwards towards the desk. The middle wires, so wire 2, wire 3, wire 4, they've all got an essence of mobility during this part of the tutorial. So if these end loops do move around, try not to worry about it overly much. It won't matter because you will be able to manipulate them to move around if you have to. So to begin with, we're going to wind onto the number 3, the middle wire. And to do this, I'm going to allow about an inch of wire, about an inch from the end, and I'm just going to wrap that a good 3 or 4 times. It doesn't really matter as long as you finish with the same number of wraps at the other end. You might prefer to do this with your dominant hand rather than your non-dominant hand. Do just make sure that it's a nice tight little coil, and you can certainly tidy that up a little bit more than I have here. Let's just find that end and twist that away so that it sits neatly against that core wire. So that again is the number 3 wire, and I've gone for, I think, 5 wraps. So let's bring in the number 2 wire next, and what we're going to do is wrap number 3 and number 2 together with 2 wraps around both of those wires. So that's all the way around, and I've returned the wire that I'm using is 0.4mm gauge, and I'm working from the reel. I've gone for a silver plated copper so that it shows up against that copper wire that I've used as my main wire here. So I bring that all the way around twice, and then I'm going to bring the tail of the wire, still connected to the reel, up between those 2. So below the number 3 and above the number 2. I'm then going to bring in my lower, my number 1 looped wire, and just get that to sit in position. If you want those loops to be nice and tidy, you can try and keep them all side by side stacked, but they will just wibble around anyway. So we're going to make our first connection to that number 1 wire, the lower of my looped sections, by rotating twice around wire 2 and wire 1. So draw the wire underneath and then up between 2 and 3. Draw that over nice and tight, and then all the way up the rear of the design. So you can see so far we've wound on with 5 wraps around wire number 3, then we've got 2 wraps around 3 and 2, 2 wraps around 2 and 1. Now these end pieces are going to be a little bit annoying to begin with, but it will all come together shortly. So we're going to come back upwards now. We've gone kind of downwards on a downward slope with those weaves. We're going to wrap again twice around the middle, number 3, and the number 2 wire. So bring that all the way around. Don't pull it so tight that you then won't be able to get a wire up between, but it does need to be nice and flat. So all the way around, and then again down between 1 and 2. We're going to draw that up the rear of the design. Every time you do those 2 little wraps, you can scooch them up super neatly together. If you wish to and you have access, you can give them a little bit of a squish, very, very softly at this stage because we may need to move things around. We're then going to add in our number 4 wire and just slide that on top for now. What we now need to do next is to wrap around the number 3 and number 4 wires. So let's take the wire up over the top, down between 3 and 2. Difficult to see today. So over the top of those 2 wires side by side, and then down, and you can just scooch that wire up as you move through, making sure that you have tension but not so much tension that you can't then get a single wire between each of these. So I'm going to wrap around that twice. If it helps you, you can just very, very softly draw that end out, but you don't want to put too much pressure on it, honestly. So I've got my second wrap around those 2 wires, draw that all the way up the back. Now we're going to bring in the number 5. What we must do at this stage is make sure that the end loops are facing downwards, because there's only one way that this pattern works, and that's with those loops facing downwards. So let's bring that into position and then draw around the number 5 and number 4 wires. So if it helps, you can just spread that apart with your fingertip, draw the wire down and push that over, keeping that loop facing downwards. And then for a second time, we'll go down between number 3, that middle wire, and number 4. So pull that into position. So you've got the beginnings of your zigzag weave just there. If I just flash that in the light, you can see it's a little bit loose at the moment, but it will start to come together. So just tidy everything up as you go. Now the next thing you're going to need to do is to bring that wire up underneath the number 5, that top looped section. Pull that firmly into position, and then you will wrap around the number 4 and number 3 wires. So what I'm going to do is move on for a couple of sort of up and down sections of weaving, and then I'll join you when I come to one of the loops. I just want to get this to be a little bit neater so you can see some progress, and then I'll show you how you approach the issue of attaching the wire around those straight sections when you come to one of the loops. So I'll join you back in a second. So it's slightly unwieldy to begin with, but if you want to, what you can do is just gently splay out the ends of the wire to help it just gain access just a little bit easier. So I'm going to show you how to overcome when that winding wire hits one of the loops at the edges of your bangle. Let's head back down to the board and we'll go through that process now. Once you've got those first few peaks and valleys done, it starts to become a little bit more well behaved. So as you can see, we're reaching the bottom of this valley section now, and what you've got is a loop in the way of where you want to wind your finer gauge wire. So what we're going to do is to grab some chain nose pliers and just gently open that loop section up by twisting it sideways. And you'll be able to get the wire inside that section like so. So what we were going to do is wind twice around the number 1 and number 2 wires. So scooch that all the way over into the gap you've just created. That's 1 wind and 2 winds. Make sure that sits inside. You can push that down with pliers or with a nail if you prefer. And then you continue on your merry way. Let's bring the wire up between number 1 and number 2 so that we can continue the ascent back up the weave. So we're wrapping now around 2 and 3. Once you've got a couple of steps underway, let's go now between 2 and 3 and over the top of number 4. So we're wrapping 3 and 4. Scooch that up into position, and you can see we're hitting a loop at the top. But I just want to show you that just to close up, you can do that by hand, or you can reverse that little sideways key twist just to get the loop to close up again. So we've got one at the top, helpfully, and we're just going to open that loop up slightly just by twisting sideways. You can twist in the other direction, and if I just flip that over, you'll see we've got a little bit more access now inside that loop. So if we now wrap wire number 4 and 5 together, all the way over the top, a second turn around 4 and 5, bring the wire down the back, and you can again close that up by hand if you're using that 1mm, or if you go to the 1.25 16 gauge, you can just reclose that. I'm just supporting the rest of the loops with my non-dominant hand, bringing that back into position. And in that way, you'll be able to continue with your weave in exactly the same way and not be interrupted by those loops on either side. So just continue until you get just past the last loop and try and recreate your starting position. You can do any weave you fancy, obviously, with this design, but I'm just going to continue until I get to the end, and then I'll join you back in a moment and we'll move on to the next stage of today's tutorial. So I appreciate it's a bit of a faff, but once you are there, it's absolutely wonderful. A lot of things in life follow that same rule. Put the effort in, get the fun and joy out of it. So let's head down to the board and we'll take a look at how to move on from here. So the next thing you'll need to do is just make sure that all of those loops are in the same orientation and that they line up as best as you can possibly get them to line up. So you might need to just compress them from the side slightly, give that end a bit of strengthening, and then at the other end just give that a little bit of movement until it fits. So this piece will be like a half bangle. The piece I created earlier is a 3/4 bangle. And you can finish those off with either a bit of chain, or you could add some extended loops like I have done here, which is a hook and hoop fastening, which I'll be showing you on next week's video. So let's just pop that one back down there. So what we're going to do is actually borrow this round form to start generating a nice curve for this woven swing bangle. So with a piece of woven work like this, just kind of go slowly. Your wire's already seen some action. We don't want to over stress it. Do try it out. Make sure that you like how it looks. That's going to be really lovely. So what we then need to do is just bring those ends over. Now you can use a ring bending plier to do that if you have one. If you don't, you can just very carefully start moving those end sections over the top until you get the shape and size that you're after. Now, if you're going for the 3/4 bangle like I have here, you don't have to have huge, great big long lengths of wire connecting everything together because it's getting quite close to being completed. However, with a shorter one like this, I think what I might do actually is trim these ends away and make these loops much shorter so I can show you what it would look like as a half bangle, just so that you can see sort of two different options. So I'm just going to trim away those ends, make the loops a little bit closer to the end of my weaving, and then we'll take it from there. So I've curved around the woven section so that it fits neatly around the back of my wrist with a little bit of space to spare so it's comfortable during wear. I've added a piece of handmade chain at one end, and at the other end I've got all of those loops nicely lined up. So I'm going to use a handmade clasp today, and I'll show you in a video that is upcoming how to create your own hook and loop clasp selection. You can use any kind of clasp or closure that you like. Now with this one I need to make sure that the hook is upwards and outwards, so that means that when I slide it through the hole like so, I need to do it with the hook facing downwards so that when it flips, it faces the correct way. So let's hold that into position, and all we're doing is hooking into those last little loops that we had at the end of the woven section before gripping across the round form that links everything together and wrapping around that center section. So I'm going to finish with the wire cut underneath if I possibly can, just because it looks a little bit neater. And then if we trim that away just before, the bead that I've used here is a 6mm crazy lace agate, which is what I've used on these demonstration pieces just here. So let's grip hold of that very firmly and bring the tail around to the underside and just get it to fill that little wiry gap. Smooth it down so that you don't feel that, and then that part of the design is nice and complete. Just give that a squish to make sure that it sits neat and tidy and that you're happy with the finish, and then you can hook that into whatever part of your chain. You can use ready-made or handmade like I have. This is my very strong no solder infinity chain, and I'll put a link up in the video for you if you want to learn how to make that. But that's the basis of today's tutorial. What I'm going to show you now is how you can add either beads like the ones I've added here. You can either add them on both sides or on one side only. There's lots of movement in this design. It's really beautiful to wear. So I've got a selection of little spirals that you can use. Or you can, of course, go to your bead stash and grab a bead and create with lots of beads. If you're going to do the spiral route, I'll show you how to create those now. Let's just give this a quick measure. That's 2-inch length of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. It's been flush cut at both ends. And I'm going to use my round nose pliers, which are all the way over there. just to create a small central circular form, much like we do whenever we're making spirals. So it doesn't fit all the way around until you start pushing that into your non-dominant hand. And I'm going to keep these quite small and go for 2.5 rotations around that central aperture. Once you've got a little bit of wire left, and that's about 1/4 inch, I'm just going to pull that away straight, and then I'm going to just pull that up gently away from the little disc we've just made, back to those round pliers, and just rotate that all the way around, and you make very, very simple, small little spiral charms. So what I will then do is grab the completed woven section and add these on to each of the loops. Now you could add multiples, or you could add beads as I have shown you in the example just here. So all you do is open up the little openable loop you've created, slide that on through, flip that over and close the loop up, so that it sits really nice and tidy. Once it is closed up neatly, give that a really hearty squish so that it's nice and strong in wear. This gave me the sort of the mental image of a belly dancer style bangle. So I'm going to continue to add those all the way around, and you can add them on both sides so that they sit over the top and you get lots and lots of beautiful movement. I think it looks cute with the spirals or with the beads. If you want to learn how to make the beads, it's almost an identical process to the spiral making. Just going to trim the end away. This is about 3 inches of that 18 gauge 1mm wire. I'm going to start with that same spiral. So almost a whole circle. This is a slightly larger central aperture. Push that into your non-dominant hand, and I might go for 3 rotations for this piece because I've got a spare bead from my bead pot and it's quite a large one. So I've gone for 3 rotations. If you are making these little coin-inspired dangle charms, then do try to keep the same number of rotations and the same size aperture. As I said, this is just an example to share with you. Pull the wire away in exactly the same way, but you'll see there's a little bit more up at the top there. This is just from my emergency pot, so it's quite possible it won't even fit. Pretty sure it will. Let's have a gander. Can't find the hole. And as if by magic, that bead has changed into one that actually fits on the wire. How amazing is that? The magic of recording a video. So once you've got your bead in position, we're going to turn a 45-degree angle away and then use either your round nose pliers or your bail makers to just create a little open and closable loop up at the top. Even if that's a funny shaped bead, you can just rotate that into position and then trim away the excess with your flush cutters. Get right in there. And then make sure that your loop closes up. And you can add that on in exactly the same way. It's just how to make a very, very quick dangle extender or charm. And you can use whichever ones you want on your design. So you could use spirals all around. It looks really pretty when it's on the wrist, and it looks equally great when you're dangling that downwards. Everything kind of clusters together. There's lots of energy in this kind of design. So that's the Woven Swing Bangle in the belly dancer style. And next week I'll be showing you how to make this pair of hook and loop connectors. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed making these beautiful woven swing bangles with me with that belly dancer influence. Thank you so much for supporting me all through this year. I do hope that you'll continue to watch. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. It doesn't cost you anything. You get free tutorials every week, and it helps the videos get shown to more people here on YouTube. Have a fantastic end to 2024, and let's ring in 2025 together. Lots of love. See you soon. Bye for now.